In 1903, Wilbur and Orville Wright crystallized the promise of the new century when they took to the air at Kitty Hawk. But the second decade saw them hand the baton to the men who would become the captains of the aviation industry. To William Boeing, who pioneered commercial aviation in the U.S. and inaugurated the national transport system. To Dutch Kindleberger, who built some of the greatest aircraft of the Second World War and ushered his country into the space age. To James McDonnell, who built the greatest fighters of the Cold War era and superintended America's race to the moon. And to Donald Douglas, who bestrode the era of flight as no one else before or since. This is their story.
Wright brothers' flight on December 17th, 1903 is the cornerstone event in aviation because they solved the problem of powered controlled flight, a problem that had consumed mankind for centuries. The flight itself on that day wasn't observed by too many people. The Wright brothers were very meticulous planners, very meticulous engineers, and they were concerned not with publicity, but with proving that their machine could actually work. And they did.
In Europe, a fresh wave of enthusiasm for the new science of aviation followed the Wright success. Louis Blériot, a French aviator, successfully crossed the English Channel. The European powers, recognizing the airplane's military potential, launched ambitious development programs. Back home, however, American military leaders roundly ignored the Wright brothers' invention. The U.S. War Department was convinced that the future of flight lay in balloons and dirigibles. Finally, 4 years after their initial flight, the United States Army challenged the Wrights to demonstrate their flying machine, arranging a public trial under the supervision of the Signal Corps. You must successfully demonstrate 3 things, Army officials told the Wright brothers. Your airplane must be able to carry 2 people. It must achieve a speed of 36 miles per hour, and it must stay aloft for at least 1 hour. The Signal Corps then laid out the trial course, stretching between Alexandria, Virginia, and Fort Myer, just outside of Washington. On a bright autumn day in September 1908, Orville Wright arrived at Fort Myer with the airplane that would be tested. All Washington was abuzz. President Taft arrived to watch as the flying machine was uncrated and assembled. For the Wright brothers, the stakes were enormous. A $25,000 Army contract and a $5,000 bonus if the trial succeeded. The Wright airplane would be launched from a monorail. A 25-horsepower motor, designed by the Wright brothers, whirled 2 wooden propellers. Takeoff was effected by means of a catapult, consisting of a falling weight which propelled the craft down its single track. As the crowd held its collective breath, Orville Wright carefully tested the wind, then climbed into the craft, buckled his safety belt, and released the falling weight. The demonstration was a success, the Army had its airplane, and the Wright brothers had a contract.
This event's important because it marks the beginning of the aviation industry in the United States. And it's really fitting that Donald Douglas is there, one of the greatest captains of that industry. But of the 2 great dynasties of commercial aviation, it wasn't Donald Douglas who got started first. It was William Boeing.
William Edward Boeing was born in Detroit, Michigan in 1881. His father, an educated German immigrant, arrived in America penniless and died 22 years later with a fortune in timber. He left a Viennese wife and 2 children, the eldest of whom was named Wilhelm. As an adolescent, Boeing was educated abroad, attending school in Switzerland. In 1900, he entered Yale University, where he studied engineering and where Wilhelm was quickly Americanized to William, and just plain Bill to his friends. In 1903, after a disagreement with his new stepfather, Boeing left Yale, moved by the conviction that it was time to do something. Crossing the continent, he settled in Grays Harbor on the Olympic Peninsula in Washington State. There, like his father before him, he began learning the timber business.
I came to the coast in 1903 to engage in the timber and lumber business. I first went to Aberdeen, Washington.
By 1908, Boeing had made his own fortune and had taken up residence in Seattle, which was rapidly expanding from a frontier town to the nation's fastest-growing city. Prompted by news reports of the Wright brothers' public demonstration, Boeing traveled to Los Angeles in 1910 to witness America's first international aeronautical tournament. A dozen American and foreign aviators took to the skies in the aerial competition. Above a grandstand jammed with spectators, they banked and soared in their flying machines. Boeing was captivated. Before the day was out, aviation had a new disciple.
Boeing, first of all, was not an engineer. He was not a designer. He was an aviation enthusiast, and he was a businessman. And on top of that, he had a European education. He spoke French. I think his whole cosmopolitan perspective was much more widely cast than it might have been if he'd grown up in the mists of Gray's Harbor in the timber industry. For instance, when he was in L.A. in 1910 for that international exhibit, he tried very hard, since he spoke French, he tried very hard to pump the star French aviator, also tried to talk him into giving him a ride. But that was obviously something that the typical logger from the Northwest wouldn't have been able to even attempt.
Like other wealthy young bachelors, William Boeing frequented Seattle's University Club, where he spent his time smoking cigars and discussing the issues of the day. There he met George Conrad Westervelt, a Navy engineer newly arrived in the Northwest. In Westervelt, Boeing found someone who shared his passion for aviation, a feeling that was countervailed by the widely held belief that the airplane was nothing more than an expensive toy. To affirm that the aeroplane is going to revolutionize the future is to be guilty of the wildest exaggeration, trumpeted Scientific American magazine that year. On the morning of July 4th in 1914, Boeing finally got his chance to fly. He and Westervelt celebrated Independence Day by purchasing rides in a push-prop Curtiss seaplane flown by a barnstormer off Lake Washington. William Boeing went first. The pilot revved the engine, the craft raced across Lake Washington, then lifted into the air. Sitting on the lower wing of the plane, Boeing's feet were braced against footrests, his hands gripping the edge of the wing. There were no seatbelts. When the plane touched down, he exchanged places with Westervelt, then immediately went back up again when Westervelt landed. The two men spent the rest of the day repeating the experience. By mid-afternoon, they were already planning how to design a better airplane. In 1915, Boeing and Westervelt took the first steps towards designing and building a twin-float biplane. They dubbed it the B&W. A few years earlier, Boeing had commissioned a Seattle shipyard on the Duwamish River to build him a yacht. When the firm went bankrupt and couldn't complete the boat, Boeing purchased the shipyard for $10, assuming its debts. Now he put the shipwrights to work on Westervelt's airplane design. At the same time, he began constructing a boathouse on Seattle's Lake Union to serve as a hangar. The Navy ordered Westervelt back east before the airplane was finished, but Boeing persevered, and by 1916, 2 B&Ws were completed. On the morning scheduled for the first flight, the test pilot was unaccountably late. Growing impatient, Boeing climbed into the B&W, took the controls, and taxied it out into Lake Union. As the pilot rushed up to the hangar, he was just in time to see Boeing turn the new plane into the wind, gun the engine, and lift off for a quarter-mile hop.
1916 is significant. That's the year that William Boeing incorporated his company. And there's some amazing foresight in those articles of incorporation. There's such things as provisions for having schools of aeronautics to train pilots, provisions for flying passengers and freight, which at that time was unheard of. It wouldn't be for more than a decade that that would be an accepted thing.
He had I think, a wider perspective on world affairs than might be expected even in the University Club in its day. And I think as a consequence, his concern with aviation and his concern for affairs in Europe merged in such a way that he became conscious and concerned about the fact that American aviation was falling behind the pace set by Europeans, above all the French and the Germans, with military aviation in particular. When American interest in the war began to intensify with the sinking of the Lusitania, with American lives lost in May of 1915, I think he took it upon himself, it appears that he took it upon himself to sort of ring the bell to wake up America. He flew over Seattle in November that year, dropping artificial cardboard bombs on the city with leaflets urging the citizens of Seattle to pay attention to the need for military aviation. And America was lagging in a critical part of war preparation.
In 1917, as Boeing had foreseen, the U.S. entered World War I on the side of the Allies. By this time, the B&W had given way to an improved version called the Model C. After a successful trial, the Navy ordered 50 of the seaplanes as trainers, then gave Boeing an additional contract to build 50 Curtiss flying boats. At the peak of the wartime production effort, 337 people were on the Boeing payroll, including pilots, draftsmen, carpenters, boat builders, and seamstresses. The signing of the armistice in 1918 brought American soldiers back home and parades to the nation's towns and cities. But it signaled disaster for the aviation industry. The U.S. government abruptly halted airplane production. The Navy canceled half its order. To make things worse, a glut of surplus warplanes was dumped on the civilian market. Within a few months, 90% of America's new aviation companies had gone out of business. In Seattle, the workforce dropped to 30 people. Intent on holding a nucleus of workers together, Boeing put his employees to work at anything that would turn a dollar. They manufactured bedroom furniture and speedboats. To stave off bankruptcy, he began depleting his personal fortune, advancing $90,000 from his own account to meet the weekly payroll.
Well, you know, in 1919, Boeing's work crew is cut to the bone, cut to 30 craftsmen, retained when the industry went belly up, actually, after the war and the sudden drop in military aviation orders. Among that handful of people was young George Pocock, a boat builder and a craftsman in his own right. And Pocock remembers those days with Boeing as a time when Boeing said, very matter-of-factly, I will fund this operation for the next 2 years. We'll build whatever we can, but at the end of those 2 years, we'll never look back.
In 1919, William Boeing hit upon a fresh idea to rejuvenate slumping airplane sales. On March 2nd, Boeing and pilot Eddie Hubbard climbed into a Model C and took off from Lake Union, heading for the Royal Vancouver Yacht Club. Upon their arrival, the Canadians, with appropriate ceremony, handed them a mail sack containing 60 letters addressed to the States. When Boeing and his pilot returned, they had completed the first international mail flight. Unfortunately, the stunt didn't create any extra business, and the Boeing Airplane Company continued to bleed red ink, costing its owner another $300,000 the following year. Boeing's perseverance would pay off, though. The 20s were just around the corner.
The 1920s, the Roaring 20s, put a stamp on the decade, put a stamp on the age. And the pace of life speeded up. It was, in that alone, it was a social revolution. The Roaring 20s didn't roar so loudly everywhere and for everybody. Maybe Main Street was not quite as affected by it as Broadway. And it was reflected in dramatic ways, in faster music, in faster cars, in faster living, in faster dances. And women took on roles that they hadn't had before. They could wear their hair differently. They could wear shorter skirts. They could smoke and swear and drink. And they could generally upset society in the way that men had always felt freer to do.
Frightened by its excesses, the United States passed the prohibition laws, forbidding itself to drink alcohol. This led to the creation of speakeasies and, in turn, to organized crime. And at the forefront of this turbulent era was the airplane, coming of age. (1919) and the early 20s were the years of the great barnstormers. Many of them young World War I pilots who couldn't find a job and who went from town to town and county fair to county fair, giving hair-raising demonstrations. In Seattle, a 1921 Army contract to build 200 pursuit fighters put William Boeing's stripped-down workforce back in business. Boeing's introduction of technical innovations, such as lightweight arc-welded frames, made the Seattle manufacturer the country's leading producer of military pursuit planes in the 1920s.
I think the important point to make about William Boeing is that he was very hardworking and very independent. He was also very reserved, a very private person, and the company took on these attributes to the point where the company itself was detached from the rest of the community, even to the point where when they'd roll out an aircraft, where today it's a huge event, then they didn't even invite the press. It was enough that a couple of engineers and some people were there to push the airplane out the door and make sure it flew.
In 1925, President Calvin Coolidge signed legislation permitting the country's airmail routes to be contracted to private operators. And the following year saw these routes open to competitive bidding. The Boeing Airplane Company was awarded the western section of the transcontinental airmail service, flying the 2,000-mile route between Chicago and San Francisco. William Boeing won the contract by radically underbidding his competitors, and the basis for his low bid was a new Boeing plane, the Model 40.
What made the Model 40 so important was that it was equipped with a radical new engine, the Pratt & Whitney Wasp, which was air-cooled, weighed 200 pounds less than equivalent water-cooled Liberty engine, and because of that, it could carry equivalent poundage, extra poundage of mail, and Boeing could underbid its competitors and actually fly the mail and do so profitably.
Although Boeing engineers designed the Model 40 specifically to carry letters and packages, the boss insisted they also include a passenger compartment. From the start of the mail operation, declared William Boeing, we looked ahead to the time when passengers would become of primary importance.
Airmail service gave rise to the passenger service. It created the airline industry. The first passengers traveled most uncomfortably, often sitting on mail bags, often were bumped off. The ride was uncomfortable because they were crammed in there, but it got started that way.
1927 was a banner year for America. Babe Ruth hit 60 home runs. And a young Charles Lindbergh completed the first non-stop solo transatlantic flight, taking off in New York and landing 33 hours later in Paris.
He made it. Charles A. Lindbergh, Lucky Lindy as they call him.
1927 also marked the founding of the Boeing Air Transport Service. 24 Boeing Model 40s were ready to begin flying the mail on the western transcontinental route. On July 1st in San Francisco, Mrs. William E. Boeing inaugurated the new service. Lindbergh's flight helped popularize the idea of passenger travel throughout the nation. 1928 saw the inaugural flight of the Boeing Model 80A, which carried 18 passengers in relative luxury. Each window seat had a wall-mounted reading light and individually controlled air vents. The cabin was soundproofed and heated. The seats were soft, and there was a spacious restroom at the rear of the cabin. The Model 80A also provided on-board stewardesses for the very first time, all of them registered nurses. By the following year, Boeing was carrying 30% of the nation's mail and a major portion of the passengers across the western United States. The company was no longer simply building planes. William Boeing was now running an air transport service and maintaining a fleet of airplanes, along with a school for pilots and maintenance crews.
William Boeing really foresaw that it would be the aviation companies that would be the ones that would build the infrastructure for the national transportation system. It really wasn't the government's place or an individual business's place to do this. They couldn't do it. They couldn't build products and provide services and all the other things that were necessary to make this happen. It would really take a holding company to do this. So at that time, all the major aviation companies got together and formed holding companies.
William Boeing and Fred Rentschler, president of Pratt & Whitney Engine, set up a new holding company called United Aircraft and Transport, with Boeing as chairman. The new company included Chance Vought, Hamilton Propeller, several airports and smaller transport companies, plane makers Sikorsky, Northrop, and Stearman, and a new passenger service, United Airlines. In 1933, William Boeing's company gave the aviation world its first glimpse of the future. It was called the Model 247. Built to carry passengers in the utmost comfort, the sleek, all-metal, low-wing monoplane was the country's first modern airliner. And it pointed the way for all successive models. Next to the 247, the slower, noisier Ford trimotors used by competing airlines suddenly resembled antiques.
It cut travel time from about 30 hours for transcontinental to 19 hours and 45 minutes, dramatically improving productivity. When it came out in 1930, it immediately helped United Airlines' bottom line, and so threatened its competition, which was TWA, that they felt that they had to get 247s or go out of business.
Jack Fry, president of TWA, immediately put in a purchase order for the new Boeing plane. However, the company had committed the first year's production of 247s to its own airline, United, and the board of directors informed Fry that he would have to wait. Fry was incensed. He immediately began seeking other manufacturers, and he found one in Southern California. "Can you build me a plane like that?" demanded Fry. "You bet I can," replied the young plane maker. His name was Donald Douglas. Donald Wills Douglas was born in 1892 in Brooklyn, New York, the younger son of a New York bank employee. Although sailing was his early passion, news of the Wright brothers' first flight in 1903 stirred his imagination as nothing else had. When newspapers heralded the Army trials at Fort Myer, the 16-year-old Douglas persuaded his mother that he had to witness the event firsthand. His glimpse of Orville Wright's 1908 flight illuminated the path he was to follow the rest of his life. In 1909, following his older brother's footsteps, Douglas was appointed to the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland.
Douglas at the Academy was given a nickname as his standard practice there, nicknamed Gunboat Douglas in his case. But he was anything but a gunboat midshipman. His outlet was building and test flying model airplanes. He test flew them in the daytime out of his window in Bancroft Hall. He test flew them at night in the vast echoing darkness of the Academy Armory. He'd test fly them with rubber band motors. He had one disastrous but spectacular attempt to launch one with a black powder pinwheel motor. All it succeeded in doing was blowing up and darkening the inside of his room in Bancroft Hall.
As a midshipman, Douglas also witnessed the birth of naval aviation. Gazing from the window of his dormitory room in 1911, he watched as the Navy's very first biplanes were launched on the Severn River. But Annapolis had no formal courses in aeronautics, and Douglas grew frustrated. In 1912, he transferred to MIT, completing the 4-year mechanical engineering course in 2 years. Upon graduation in 1914, he became the country's first graduate student in aeronautical engineering, helping build America's first scientific wind tunnel. In 1915, on the recommendation of his instructors at MIT, Douglas was offered the position of chief engineer for the Glenn L. Martin Company in Los Angeles. He was 23 years old. "But you're just a boy," remarked Glenn Martin when he first caught sight of his youthful chief engineer. Martin quickly discovered that this boy knew more about aeronautics than perhaps anyone else in North America. When the United States entered the First World War, the government appointed Donald Douglas chief engineer of the Army's new Aviation Corps. His task? To coordinate America's scattered airplane builders in the effort to speed production.
Young Donald Douglas, all of 25 years old, is summoned to Washington from his work at the Martin Company and is expected to become the chief engineer of this newly born Aviation Corps of the U.S. Army. He has a big job. He expects naturally to be examined by the government as a civil service matter of course, as an aeronautical engineer, and discovers that, lo and behold, the examination has been waived. And that is why? Well, that's because the government could find no one whose skills and knowledge in aeronautical engineering exceeded that of Douglas himself.
At the conclusion of the war, Douglas rejoined the Martin Company, now located in Cleveland, where he designed the Martin MB-1 bomber, his first major success. By 1920, however, Donald Douglas was ready to strike out on his own, and he returned to Los Angeles to establish an airplane company. But the post-war recession that was strangling William Boeing's business in Seattle was also affecting Southern California. Unable to find financing, Douglas was nearly out of options when millionaire sportsman David R. Davis appeared.
Well, Davis was a wealthy amateur aviator with a burning desire to set a new non-stop coast-to-coast record. He came to Douglas, fronted him $40,000 to design and build a plane for that purpose, and the Davis-Douglas Company was born. Spectacularly housed in an office in the back of a barber shop on Pico Boulevard.
Collecting a small crew of former Martin Company colleagues, Douglas began designing and building the new plane. They nicknamed it the Cloudster. With Davis at the controls, the Cloudster set out on its coast-to-coast flight in 1921, but was forced down over Texas. Losing interest, Davis left the company soon after. But by this time, Donald Douglas had landed a contract with the Navy to build torpedo bombers. Based on the Cloudster design, the DT-1 and DT-2 for Douglas Torpedo 1 and 2 soon rolled out of the makeshift factory. And the Douglas Aircraft Company was on its way. In 1922, Douglas moved the company to an abandoned film studio on Wilshire Boulevard in Santa Monica, with enough orders to keep his workforce employed. 2 years later, the U.S. Army Aviation Service mounted the first around-the-world flight, commissioning Donald Douglas to build the airplanes for the journey. The Army contract called for 5 planes designated DWC for Douglas World Cruiser. On St. Patrick's Day in 1924, 4 of the 5 took off from Clover Field, Douglas's new base in Santa Monica. They were bound for Seattle, the official start point of the world tour. But beforehand, to better acquaint foreign countries with the U.S., the aircraft were christened after prominent cities. Landing at Sand Point in Seattle, the 4 Douglas planes were refitted with pontoons by engineers from the Boeing Airplane Company. The occasion was marked by a picnic lunch. Shortly after 8 a.m. on the morning of April 6, 1924, coincidentally Douglas's 32nd birthday, the planes were airborne and heading northwest on the 600-mile first leg to Prince Rupert Island. It was not until 6 months later that the flyers would return to Seattle. The coordination of Douglas-trained mechanics and U.S. military services was nothing short of superb. But once last-minute replacements and adjustments were made, the flyers were on their own. It was to be one of the largest American flag-waving exercises seen to date, covering a total of 27,500 miles in just 175 days of actual flying time. The tour spread the name of American aviation to the far corners of the world. In Japan, old and young alike welcomed these unsung pioneers of early air travel. In China, age-old junks came face-to-face with the New World. With the international press covering the expedition, audiences in movie theaters watched each thrilling chapter unfold in newsreels. American flyers were making aviation history in Douglas planes. Only 3 of the original 5 planes touched down on the North American continent, one having crashed near Alaska and the other having ditched over the Atlantic. In the vast crowd, a veritable who's who of dignitaries waited to greet the record breakers back to U.S. shores. And as the planes returned to Seattle on September 28th, completing history's first flight around the world, a proud mother stands beside Donald Douglas, the 32-year-old architect of the event.
At the conclusion of this great event, William Boeing, the reserved, reticent businessman, but always the supporter of American aviation, takes out his first paid advertisement. Is it to sell Boeing aircraft? No, it's to congratulate his commercial rival, Donald Douglas, on the success of his round-the-world flight.
In 1927, the year that William Boeing began flying the mail, Donald Douglas successfully marketed his M-series mail planes. But it was his celebrated head-to-head rivalry with his Seattle counterpart that gave notice to the aviation world that Douglas aircraft had arrived. In 1932, the United Air Transport Board of Directors had voted to put off selling the Model 247 to TWA. The airline's president then commissioned Douglas to build a similar plane, and Douglas was determined to go Boeing one better. He designed a plane that was both larger and faster than the Model 247 and capable of carrying more passengers. They named it the DC-1 for Douglas Commercial One, prototype of the DC-2. The DC-2 carried 14 passengers and was capable of an astonishing 200 miles per hour. This was soon refined to the DC-3, which carried 21 passengers and featured Pullman sleeping berths. The Douglas DC-2 and DC-3 swept the commercial aviation market.
This was a huge lesson for the Boeing company, and it had repercussions that went on for decades. Within a year, the DC-2 had surpassed the 247, virtually putting it out of business. And at that time, the Douglas Aircraft Company took over commercial aviation, and Donald Douglas held the reins of commercial aviation for the next 2 decades.
Carrying nearly 90% of all U.S. air traffic in the 1930s, the DC-2 and DC-3 became the darling of America's passenger airlines.
Well, the rivalry between the Boeing 247 and the Douglas DC-2 and the DC-3 took place against the background of great turmoil in the United States. You had, beforehand, they had the relative prosperity of the 1920s against all of a sudden this massive economic chaos of the Great Depression, the worst economic depression in the history of the country.
In the closing months of 1929, the stock market crashed. Without the financial safety nets that exist today, the market virtually imploded, dropping lower and lower until it finally hit rock bottom. A great number of American businesses, including banks, were completely wiped out. By the early 30s, the economy had virtually ground to a halt. Nearly a third of the nation's workforce was thrown out of work. The wealthy lost their fortunes, the middle class lost their savings, and the poor began to starve.
I, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, do solemnly swear.
Franklin Roosevelt swept into office in January of 1933 on a wave of alarm and dismay over the Great Depression, which has the country in its grips and has had for going on 3 years by that time.
Our greatest primary task is to put people to work. This is no unsolvable problem if we face it wisely and courageously.
There's also a great deal of pressure to rectify the presumed flaws in capitalism, and this naturally creates a sort of populist demand that that big business be dealt with and dealt with severely.
In the wake of the stock market crash, one of the few industries that managed to prosper was the airplane industry. Production orders continued and factories were busy. As Roosevelt took office, William Boeing's company, with its manufacturing interests, its lucrative mail contracts, and booming passenger airline, now controlled fully half of America's aviation industry. Such economic success, however, came with a price. In the late summer of 1931, stories appeared in the Hearst newspapers which gave the aviation industry a black eye. The government's airmail contracts, charged a Hearst reporter, had been corruptly distributed to aviation leaders at an alleged spoils conference. Accusations of collusion were leveled at the former Postmaster General and United Air Transport's William Boeing and Fred Rentschler, who were characterized as robber barons and malefactors of great wealth.
In fact, the story is patently false. William Boeing did not collude with anybody. Hoover's Postmaster General, Walter Folger Brown, simply refused to issue airmail contracts to fly-by-night barnstormers who lacked the resources to fly the mails safely and responsibly.
President Hoover's Postmaster General Walter Folger Brown was a very far-sighted individual. He guaranteed we had a national network operated by efficient airlines operating in the public interest, and he guaranteed that so-called fly-by-night operators who were not capable of carrying the mail or passengers safely or efficiently were not given access to public monies.
But the climate of hysteria and economic recriminations was not conducive to fact-finding. In 1933, the new Congress appointed Senator Hugo Black, an Alabama Democrat and former prosecutor, to investigate the controversy. An ardent opponent of big business, Black quickly drew his conclusions.
Recent investigations have disclosed that all airmail contracts were awarded after the operators had agreed among themselves and with the Postmaster General upon an allocation of various airmail routes throughout the country. Under these circumstances, the contracts were made in violation of law. They were made by collusive agreement among the operators themselves and with certain government officials. There was therefore no alternative left to the President and the Postmaster General except to cancel these contracts. We cannot build up an aviation industry upon a rotten foundation.
Assembling a Senate subcommittee, Black called the leaders of United Air Transport to testify and went after William Boeing with a vengeance.
Now, Mr. Boeing, you still state...
With no real evidence of collusion, Hugo Black, an ardent foe of big corporations, places William Boeing on the stand and publicly assails him with charges that essentially reduced having made too much money. This type of character assassination anticipates the un-American activities charges that would later be raised by McCarthy in the 1950s.
The hearings were covered by an avid press, whose stories of corrupt businessmen in collusion with the Postmaster General were eagerly consumed by a Depression-era public. The Hearst papers tripled their readership. As the scandal continued, Roosevelt summarily canceled all domestic airmail contracts between the government and the airlines. In their stead, he ordered the Army Air Corps to begin flying the mail. The results were immediate and disastrous. 3 Army Air Corps pilots were killed during a practice run. By the end of the Army's first week in its new assignment, another 3 had been killed and 5 more critically injured. The combination of inexperienced pilots and severe winter weather proved lethal. Charles A. Lindbergh testified before the Black Committee and vehemently denounced the government's attack on the aviation industry.
I believe that the bill leaves untouched the most fundamental question in this situation, and that is whether or not these airlines have a right to trial before they are convicted of the guilt which is implied. In my mind, it is one of the most unjust acts I have ever seen in American legislation.
Public opinion began to turn, and the administration began to backtrack. In April, the government announced it would accept new bids from the airlines for airmail contracts. According to a decree hammered out by Senator Black, however, the airlines would be effectively separated from their manufacturing bases. The government ordered the aviation holding companies to break up. United Aircraft and Transport was forced to divide, leaving Boeing in Seattle as its smallest remnant.
Well, William Boeing was a true pioneer in the sense that he foresaw a national transportation system based on the airliner. He understood that for aviation to succeed, it had to be taken to the next level with proper amounts of capital so they could develop the entire industry to the benefit of the entire nation. And he did that. The irony about this is that they were so successful, so profitable, that they controlled 50% of the entire aviation industry, that they naturally became the primary target of an investigation. Wrongfully, because everything they had done had been above board and always had been above board. Boeing would not have had it any other way. But nevertheless, they were attacked because of their success. And Boeing was publicly humiliated in the Senate hearings. He was later exonerated, but 7 years later, long after the fact, the damage had already been done.
Imagine what it was like. This private, reticent, shy man thrust up on the national stage and publicly pilloried. Not only were his honesty and integrity impugned, but his patriotism as well.
For this most private of men, with his deeply held patriotism, the public humiliation of the Senate hearings was unbearable. William Boeing returned to Seattle, sold every bit of his stock in the company he had built, and left the industry.
So it's a sobering conclusion to this episode, really, the Boeing chapter. Leaving the industry that he had done so much to develop and indeed had, for all intents and purposes, led for the previous decade. But so much had been accomplished in such a short time. When Boeing started in the industry or in aviation, airplanes were essentially box kites with engines and rudimentary controls. As he leaves, Boeing has presented the industry with the prototype of the modern airplane. Single wing, stressed aluminum fuselage, enclosed cabin, later will be pressurized. Even the fixed landing gear will eventually disappear. So the future is clearly on display with the Boeing 247. As Boeing leaves, and the arc of his career is descending now, it passes and intersects the rising arc of Donald Douglas, who, in Boeing's place now, will guide and propel the industry for the coming decades.
I guess I must be getting old, because somehow it becomes fun to reminisce. Well, my first memory of things in aviation was seeing the first Wright airplane demonstrated for the Signal Corps in 1908 at Fort Myers, outside of Washington. So I took the streetcar and one thing and another and got out to Fort Myers. Well, there she was, as I had seen her pictured, the old Wright pusher. And there were Wilbur and Orville. And there was that old launching device that kind of looked like a guillotine, and they had the airplane perched up at the starting part of the track and the weight all ready to go. And I remember well, I believe it was Wilbur, going out, holding up a bit of dust and dropping it to see that there wasn't a bit of wind. And then, as I recall, it was Wilbur that got into the machine with, I guess it was Colonel Lom, and they pulled the old latch, and down this little wooden track it went with those funny old props batting around at apparently a pretty slow speed, and off she went.